This morning, I'm going to talk about Prader-Willi syndrome, capacity and decision making. And it's very much a view from Ireland that has, I suppose, come to the fore in the last couple of years with the introduction of the Assisted Decision Making Act. It was originally signed into law in 2015, but it really only hit the legislative books in 2023. We are quite slow at introducing legislation in this country sometimes. Um, and what the Assisted Decision Making Act is there for is to support people who may lack capacity to make decisions in particular areas of their life. So to start off with, the definition in Irish law of capacity is the person's ability to understand at the time a decision is to be made, the nature and consequences of the decision to be made by him or her in the context of the available choice at the time. So obviously that then means that a person lacks capacity if they're unable to either understand, retain, use or weigh up or communicate that decision. And I think, for many adults with Prader-Willi syndrome, they may well understand the issues related to the syndrome, but in certain circumstances, they're unable to use and weigh up that information to arrive at a decision. Particularly around food. And I think although people with Prader-Willi syndrome, have great capacity and can make decisions about many areas of their life, the dysfunction, particularly in the hypothalamus area of the brain that controls eating behavior and energy balance, means that they may not have capacity to independently make decisions about eating. I often kind of think the best people to talk about hyperphagia and the best people to explain about hyperphagia are adults. And I've had occasion to sit down with a young lady called Maria and talk to her. I've spoken to a number of our adults about how Prader-Willi syndrome impacts their life. And what Maria basically said was that people don't understand. I'm not like other people. With me, I've very little or no control. I know for me, it takes over. When I have a compulsion, especially when it's one of the stronger ones, it takes over my mind. Literally, all I can think of is food and how to get food. It completely takes over my mind and turns me into someone I'm not. And I think for me, the really impactful part of my conversation with Maria was that she almost separates her Prader-Willi syndrome and herself, her individualism. Hyperphagia, I suppose, is the one thing that I find when I'm dealing with providers or dealing with funders. It's the one thing that it's almost the hardest part of the conversation to get them to understand. But when we were setting up or in the process of setting up our respite service, applying for the funding, we were working with a government official from the National Clinical Programme for people with disabilities. And again, throughout the beginning of the process, I always kind of thought, okay, they say they understand hyperphagia, but I'm not really sure they really get it. So I brought this gentleman who was a psychologist called Mac, a really nice guy, really good guy, to one of the services, a Prader-Willi syndrome service. And he spoke to a couple of people with PWS about hyperphagia. And the day after the visit, he went on holidays. And in the third day of his holiday, he sent me an email. And he said to me, I think the penny has finally dropped. He said, hyperphagia in Prader-Willi syndrome doesn't really represent a choice, but a genetic predetermination. This constitutes a compulsion which actually removes choice. Choice is returned by reducing anxiety, which undermines executive functioning. And in a lower state of anxiety, people are able to make choices which more authentically align with their goals, both when it comes to food and in other aspects of their life. And I thought to myself, there's someone who's actually really sat down and thought about the impact hyperphagia has. And Mark has been a really good advocate for Prader-Willi Syndrome Association and for adults and children with Prader-Willi syndrome in this country. But there are other areas, I suppose, or other characteristics of Prader-Willi syndrome that may affect or may impact on decision making. The first one, I suppose, is that impaired executive functioning. Executive functions allow us to, such as impulse control, planning, and flexibility, are sometimes impaired in people with Prader-Willi syndrome. So this can make it harder for them to resist food cravings, even when they understand the health risks. There can be altered reward sensitivity. So sometimes individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome will have an altered reward system, causing them to experience heightened pleasure from eating. And this can lead to stronger than normal desires to seek food as a reward. Obsessive compulsive traits. Many people with PWS will exhibit these OC traits, which can manifest as repetitive thoughts or actions that are centered on food. And this can dominate sometimes the decision-making process. And then finally, emotional and social factors. So people with PWS can sometimes struggle with emotional regulation and social decision-making, and quite often feel really anxious, very highly anxious or stressed if denied access to food. So again, I'll just come back to that quote by Mark, that hyperphagia in PWS does not necessarily represent a choice, but is a genetic predetermination. This constitutes a compulsion, which actually removes choice. And this is very much I suppose, the way we are approaching Prader-Willi syndrome and decision-making around food. So what supports can we give our adults and children with Prader-Willi syndrome in terms of supporting their decision making? First of all, environmental controls, so limiting access to food and establishing routine meal times can help to reduce the likelihood of impulse eating. Where, kitchens can't be locked in a lot of services, they can't. So, the recommendation is then close one-to-one support around food. The second is behavioral therapies. So techniques like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, can help individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome to build up skills that may help them resist food. Medications and hormonal treatments. I'm aware that we're in a third phase clinical program with DCCR in the US at the moment, and that may have huge benefit for adults and children with Prader-Willi syndrome in terms of hyperphagia. And then education and skill building. I think it's hugely important that we teach our individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome about healthy decision making, emphasizing the importance of balanced choices and reinforcing non-food rewards to help support a better decision making. And then in relation to parents and in relation to care providers, I think understanding the decision-making challenges associated with hyperphagia in PWS really provides essential insights into developing comprehensive care plans. And it's the care plans then that aim to reduce the impact of food seeking for our adults and children. As I said, the Assisted Decision Making Act was commenced into law in 2023. So we've been doing quite a bit of work with our local government body in relation to ensuring that the human rights of people with Prader-Willi syndrome are being met, but also while being able to support them around the issues where they may lack capacity, particularly around food and hyperphagia. So the legislation applies to a person whose decision-making capacity has been called into question, may shortly be called into question, or lacks capacity in respect to one or more matters. The Act is disability neutral, so it applies to everybody, not just people with disabilities, as we all may have a point in our lives where we may lack capacity to make a decision. But currently it only applies to adults, so over 18s. The guiding principles of the Act are presumption of capacity unless capacity is proven not to present. That individuals are given as much support around making a decision as they may require or as they need. And people sometimes have a right to make decisions that others might regard as unwise or, in some cases, eccentric. Uh, Information has to be accessible for the individual. That was already part of our Disability Act. And the Act then legally recognizes that there may be persons who the Act refers to as interveners that can support a person to maximize their decision-making capacity. And if the information can only be retained for short periods of time, that doesn't necessarily mean that the individual lacks capacity to make decisions in the long term. And I suppose what's really important in terms of Prader-Willi syndrome is that any support or any restriction should be the least restrictive intervention. And finally, then the Act, one of the guiding principles of the Act is a functional approach to capacity, which very much focuses on how the decision is made rather than what the outcome of the consequence of the decision is. So the support network offers 3 tiers of support. Starting from the bottom, the first one is a decision-making assistant, and that's appointed by a person who considers that his capacity is now in question or may shortly be in question. And relevant decisions are then set out in a decision-making agreement between the individual and the decision-making assistant. The second one then is co-decision maker, and we've had 1 or 2 parents who have gone down the route of co-decision making. And this again is appointed by the person themselves. And the co-decision maker assists the appointer to obtain and understand information and will then communicate the person's will and preference with providers or with government agencies or whoever. And they will also make an effort to ensure that the decision is implemented. The co-decision making agreement is registered with their decision support service as well, and then comes under review every number of years. The final one is decision making representative. At this stage, this requires court intervention. So a parent or a family member may decide that their adult lacks capacity to make decisions. They have to get an assessment of that lack of capacity and then have to go to court to be appointed the decision-making representative. What we have found, I suppose, is that a lot of individuals, there's been only 1 or 2 adults or parents of adults with Prader-Willi syndrome who've gone down this route. But in general, what the court are doing is they're pushing back towards the co-decision maker level. I think they feel that if there is any doubt or any possibility that the person has even the slightest capacity to make a decision, then they feel that the co-decision maker route is the best route to go to. As I said, we will support any of our families to represent their adults with Prader-Willi syndrome on any of these levels. So what is our message to parents and carers? I think it's really important that we plan for the possibility of greater independence. I know I've spoken to Hubert and Norbert at length about this, and really our individuals deserve the right to be able to make choices around their own lives. And with that, we've set up our own advocacy group in Ireland, and we've linked in with Shelley and the PWS group to I suppose support our adults to be able to not only make decisions about their own lives, but to help us as an association to make decisions, or to I suppose that they have influence on the strategies and the supports that we give them. I think that we always need to consider that in some cases this may mean managing access to food and potentially monitoring the spending of money. But there are many other areas in the life of a person with Prader-Willi syndrome that they have capacity to make decisions around. Again, return back to the quote about choice is returned by reducing anxiety, which can undermine executive functioning and limit freedom. And for me, the key to all these support strategies is that you have the agreement of the person with Prader-Willi syndrome that they are involved in every step along the way, even to the point, and it would be quite common with the adults that I've worked with, that they would give consent for the restrictions. So they give consent for kitchens to be locked. They give consent for staff to support them around food. And as I said, then it becomes more of a restrictive enabler than a restrictive practice. And that's me. So thank you for your time.